University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts.
Hi listeners, my name is Susan Pakin.
And I'm Lauren Lee.
And we're both production managers with UC3P.
So Susan, what kind of podcast do we have for today?
Well, this podcast is really going to be a fun one. It's another brand new UC3P original series called Popcorn Policy. It's a show that looks at policy through the lens of film and popular culture.
That's awesome, especially because I heard this week's episode is about Black Panther. We won't spoil the discussion for you, but in exchange, we're asking that you pause this podcast, get on your smartphone, search for Popcorn Policy, and subscribe.
And if you really like the episode, please share it with a friend. Everyone has a friend who loves movies, so make sure to let them know about it.
Want to get even more involved? Tweet us at the UC3P with your reactions or any suggestions for other movies you'd like to hear featured on Popcorn Policy.
And now, UC3P presents
Popcorn Policy.
Hi, my name is Stormy Kim. I'm a second-year MPP student at Chicago Harris and the head of Popcorn Policy, a new podcast series where we examine the policy topics presented in popular movies. This episode, MPP and MBA student Jason Zukus will host a discussion of Marvel's Black Panther with two expert panelists, MD and MA in Public Policy student Aamir Hussain and MPP student Julian Lake.
Thank you for the introduction, Stormy. This is Jason, your host for this episode. When I thought of the idea to have a Black Panther episode, I knew right away who to ask. As self-proclaimed comic book nerds, Aamir and Julian often spar about the latest Marvel movies in their free time anyway. So it took a little convincing to get them to come to record this discussion.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So for this episode, I'll focus the discussion around three key policy issues raised by the movie Black Panther. First, democratic legitimacy. Second, arming minority groups. And third, scientific diplomacy. I've organized it in this way so it gets increasingly spoilery as the episode goes on, in case you haven't seen Black Panther yet. But really, if you haven't seen the movie, you should just pause the episode and go watch it.
It's available on Netflix right now, so.
Yep, last Marvel movie that will be there. So get it while the getting's good.
Last one that'll be there? Like
yeah, Disney.
Oh.
Disney's pulling their stuff from Netflix, so.
That's brutal.
Yeah.
So let's start with democratic legitimacy. After watching Black Panther, I came out of the theater thinking to myself, wait a sec, so none of this would have been an issue if Wakanda had just had democratic elections, right? Like, the only reason why Killmonger was able to take power... Alright, sorry. There's really no way to avoid spoilers here. But the only way he was able to take power was because they still use this antiquated system where the ruling Black Panther's legitimacy rested on a test of physical strength, and anyone could challenge him on it. So my question for you two is, while elections might have made for a much less exciting movie, wouldn't that have solved all the problems that T'Challa ended up facing? A majority of Wakandans were happy with him and wanted him to keep ruling, right?
This is true, but you have to understand that if Black Panther, if T'Challa did not engage with Killmonger in this duel of fates, then it would have usurped his legitimacy as the leader of the Wakandan people. You see, Wakanda is based off strength hierarchy, and so if a challenger approached the king and challenged the throne, then it would have caused serious political damage to T'Challa's new leadership, that he was not able to dispatch this usurper from in the field of combat.
Yeah, I actually had the after this movie, I liked it so much that I read Ta-Nehisi Coates' A Nation Under Our Feet, where this is actually the main issue raised in the book, is that should we have democratic elections for this historic monarchy? And they really didn't come up with a good opinion on this, because I think I agree with Julian that the culture of this country is based very much on being able to defend your nation against invaders, and the physical strength of the king is a representation of that. So it's democratic in the sense that anybody can challenge him, but if he wins, he basically has the authority for that. And I think you raise a good point, though, which is the democratic peace theory. the fact that two democratic countries have actually never engaged in a war against each other. So right now it's more of a correlation because we can't point to specific factors behind that, but one issue raised is that if people are participating in the war, they're less likely to vote for a war that will harm them directly. So it's possible that if they were both democratic countries, they would not go to war.
There's also one other issue that I think we should mention when talking about the Black Panther, which is his connection to the Panther spirits and the past lives of all of the previous Black Panthers that preceded him. If we remember anything from DNO, that class that is no longer offered thanks to us second years, you're welcome first years.
I like DNO, okay?
Hey, you're not welcome here. Yeah, Aamir is a dual student, so don't take his word for it. Anyway, if you remember from DNO, we talked about how decisions are made best when you can draw upon multiple different perspectives and opinions to form an opinion. Now, the Black Panther, having a connection to his ancestral forefathers, can draw upon more diversity of opinions and knowledge than anybody else in Wakanda. Therefore, even though he is a monarch, he actually possesses the most democratic and diverse opinion set in the Wakandan nation.
To be fair, though, I mean, one thing that we learned is that if the signal giver in that model is flawed, then even it doesn't matter how many diverse opinions you have, you're still going to be making flawed decisions. And we try to avoid spoilers, but in the second half of the movie, T'Challa tells his dad that you were all wrong to be isolationist. We should be engaging with the rest of the world. So it turns out that wisdom of the forefather wasn't very beneficial.
Yeah, and that brings up another interesting point that you were saying that basically the Black Panther can actually draw on a lot of diverse opinions. But how diverse would you say those opinions are? Because isn't it basically only other monarchs, kind of like you're only getting the perspective of kind of the upper class, ruling class? What about kind of doing what's best for all Wakandans, including kind of lower class citizens?
That's a good question, but I think that you'd have to go back to the fact that these are all the wisest and strongest leaders in the history of the Wakandan people. So even if it's not a completely diverse set, you are taking the opinions of, say, like, Martin Luther King, Thomas Jefferson. Well, maybe not Thomas Jefferson. Abraham Lincoln. Yeah, Thomas Jefferson without the slavery. Abraham Lincoln. And all of the ones that also had to prove time and again through trial by combat and that they were an effective leader. So no one gets to become the king without going through those many different trials. So we've kind of filtered out most of the bad opinion, the bad rulers from the set.
Just to address that point, though, I think there is something interesting to talk about there. Equating the kind of trial of strength with then saying that it also means they're the wisest or have the best opinions. I mean, do we just have to respect the basis of this culture is on this kind of trial of strength and say that's just part of their own cultural norms? Or can we actually like critique that of like, is that the best kind of characteristic to focus on?
I think one point that we haven't discussed yet is Arrow's theorem. So there's an idea that you can try to create the best, most equitable system on various characteristics. Like we want representation of the people, we want certain decisions to have like ranking based on preferences and utilitarianism. And there's a model that shows the only way that you can achieve all the things is to have a dictatorship. So basically to not have a dictatorship, you have to give up some of these other things that you want. So I think Julian raises a good point that if you want to have all these things and you have essentially a dictatorship that's run by a benevolent person who actually has knowledge and is working in the interest of people, you actually have a very efficient system.
It's Plato's philosopher king. So
that's what you think we have here with the Black Panthers?
Don't you? He has direct access to the Panther spirits. I think that's as philosophical of a king as you can get.
Well, that's why I just kind of still come back to the question I asked about, is selecting a ruler based on physical strength really going to get you a philosopher king? I mean, it seems like physical strength and mental capacity are kind of pretty uncorrelated, you would say.
Well, it seems that the Black Panther, his primary job is to protect people. So that the physical strength is important, but he also has a council of advisors that he appoints to do other things. So his sister Shuri is like the scientific genius of the Empire. So her job is to oversee all of those things. So even if his job isn't to do everything, he at least knows who to appoint to accomplish those other tasks.
Also, our system here in this country is based off sort of innate charisma and entertainment to a certain extent, which isn't necessarily correlated with good leadership either. So, they use trial by combat. We use trial by words, which takes a lot longer and is much more expensive. So I don't think we're really in a fair position to judge the Wakandan people and their rituals.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, now I'll switch to the next topic. So I want to discuss arming of minority groups. So at Chicago Harris, our analytical politics classes taught us about the importance of institutions and incentives. Without changing institutions or incentives, individuals will act similarly even if they're shuffled around into different positions. So to put this more concretely, in Black Panther, Killmonger wants to arm oppressed minority groups around the world with Wakandan weapons so they can rise up against their oppressors and bring about a more just world order. But won't those newly empowered groups then have the same incentives to turn around to become the new oppressors?
Yeah, I agree. I think that was one of the flaws in his plan, was failing to account for strategic adjustment as well. So these minorities have the initial incentive to overthrow this leadership that they are oppressed by. But once they achieve those things, if they don't change the underlying systems, they're basically going to accomplish those same problems. And also, in the process, they're probably going to be harming a lot of civilians or harming the environment. And these are all like spillover effects that they have not accounted for.
Yeah, I, for the most part, agree with that. But I think that we have to look at the way that the movie plays out as sort of indicative that arming minority groups, while attractive at first, I think they juxtapose this with the actual Black Panthers in Oakland at the start of the movie and their sort of ethos of trying to exercise their right to power and self-defense, but how that could quickly spin out of control if not left to, a wise and noble ruler like the Black Panther.
Yeah, and so I think that is interesting about what if we were to believe that, these weapons really will just be used to defend minorities from oppression. Let's just give them benefit of the doubt and say that they won't actually, then use it for aggression. But I think there's still theories out there that would say that this plan is still inherently destabilizing. So the problem is that there's a duality of weapons. So most weapons can be used for either offensive or defensive purposes. So international relations scholar Robert Jervis came up with the offense-defense theory that basically says that if offensive and defensive behavior is not easily distinguishable, then there will be an intense security dilemma. So basically, even if we think that oppressed groups won't use Wakandan weapons for aggressive offensive purposes and just want to defend themselves, those around them will not be certain of this and might actually preemptively attack them regardless of their intentions. So UChicago's John Mearsheimer said, uncertainty about the intentions of other states is unavoidable, which means that states can never be sure that other states don't have offensive intentions to go along with their offensive capabilities. Does this make us reconsider Killmonger's plan even more?
I think so. I've read Mearsheimer's work as well, and I think the one thing that he misses is that there are ways you can send credible signals to other parties, and one way that people have suggested this in the past is through shared norms and values, the theory of constructivism. So I think Killmonger's strategy was arming minority groups that had some kind of connection to Wakanda. So whether they were also black or oppressed minorities, whether they had some kind of oppressive dictatorial government, there's a way you could send a credible signal to those groups that you would support them. And if those groups were working together, they could make an alliance that would accomplish the goals they want.
So you're saying that Wakanda can kind of regulate the usage of these weapons and make sure that the groups they support aren't abusing it?
I think if we're giving benefit of the doubt, that's something we could assume as well.
Mm-hmm. I think that T'Challa, towards the end of the movie, respected Killmonger's position, but like you said, like Aamir said, wanted to give better signals to indicate that they were not trying to arm people for offensive capability and more for defensive by offering sort of this scientific diplomacy, which you mentioned earlier. And so this is a way for them to, in a sense, arm minority groups that need to combat oppression, but give them this power in a way that will be less destructive and less risky to destroying human life.
Yeah, so let's move to that then. So that's the last topic I was hoping to discuss is scientific diplomacy. So, as you were alluding to, at the end of Black Panther, T'Challa proposes an alternative